Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Let me begin this morning's proceedings by thanking on behalf of all the delegates here assembled and also those who were with us last night, the President of Singapore, the staff of the Istana, and it should also be added the staff of the Shangri Hotel for the wonderful reception and dinner we had last night at the Istana. Thank you very much. This morning we have a heavily charged agenda, 3 plenaries. The fourth plenary session is entitled Military Transparency and Defense Cooperation in the Asia-Pacific. Often when the word transparency is used in the Asia-Pacific context, it's used in the particular discussions about U.S. calls for more transparency from China and Chinese responses that their level of transparency is proportionate to their level of military development. But there are all sorts of other ways in which the questions of transparency are posed in the wider region. We've noted a proliferation of defense white papers published and in prospect, themselves indicators of a desire by states to explain publicly their strategic approaches. And indeed, the more one knows, the better defense cooperation can proceed. So to examine these issues from 2 very different perspectives, we're delighted first to have the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Defense of Singapore, Teo Chee Hean here, and his presence gives me also a formal opportunity to thank our principal partner within the government of Singapore for the organization of the Shangri Dialogue, the Ministry of Defense of Singapore. I have to say we have dealt with all levels of the Ministry of Defense, numerous members of its uniformed and civilian staff, and the cooperation in this instance has been in every way transparent and easy. So it's a cooperation I recommend to others. And we have also Baroness Anne Taylor, the Minister for International Defence and Security of the Ministry of Defence of the United Kingdom, if I can put it this way, the host country of the IISS. So I look forward to these presentations and we'll engage in a debate in the usual way. First to take the podium, Minister Teo.
Thank you, John. Minister Anne Taylor, my colleagues and friends, a very warm welcome to all of you to Singapore, and it's a great pleasure to see all of you here and to have this opportunity to meet you. I hope it's not a statement about transparency that this panel has, shall I say, not the largest number of people speaking. And I'm glad that the title of this plenary session is entitled Military Transparency and Defense Cooperation, and not just military transparency. Because after all, military transparency is not an end in itself. It serves a larger objective. During the Cold War, military transparency served to avoid accidents. In an era when the opposing sides were poised with fingers on hair triggers, the objective then was to avoid misunderstandings and mistakes, to avoid accidentally sending the world into oblivion in literally a matter of minutes. Hence, the famous hotline between Washington and Moscow was established. And even when agreements were reached to limit strategic arms, the purpose of transparency was to reduce the chances of miscalculation, to ensure, for example, that satellites on each side were able to observe what the other side was doing to a degree sufficient to avoid surprises and to reduce the chance of either side cheating in between mutual inspections. It would not be appropriate to transpose this mad world of the Cold War transparency regime onto present-day circumstances in the Asia-Pacific. the strategic circumstances are not the same, and the objectives and outcomes we desire are different. The Cold War was a time of strategic certainty. Both sides were implacably opposed to each other, ideologically, geostrategically. Each side was convinced about the superiority of its socio-political system and wished to apply it to the other side. Each side was also competing for geostrategic influence in a zero-sum game in Northeast Asia, in Southeast Asia, in West Asia, in the Middle East, in Latin America. The purpose of transparency was not to build trust or cooperation for mutual benefit. In fact, the assumption was that trust and cooperation were not possible. In the Asia-Pacific, this is not the starting assumption, or at least it should not be, as such an assumption could easily become self-fulfilling. We are at the cusp of an Asia-Pacific century. The focal point of global geopolitics in the coming decades will be the Asia-Pacific, a region that is home to major powers, both present and rising. We are in a state of flux, which brings with it a degree of strategic uncertainty. With more states rapidly increasing the size and sophistication of their economies, there will be more players with burgeoning trade interests and energy and resource needs. New points of friction can arise as more states seek to secure access to sea lanes and resources, or to protect new claims to maritime zones, such as the continental shelf. As the powers realize that their spectrum of strategic interests has grown, they may increase their military capability to safeguard these interests. With economic growth, states have more resources to spend on defense and also more to defend. Of particular concern for the region are issues such as the overlapping and disputed claims to the Spratly and Paracel Islands in the South China Sea. The potential for incidents to occur between the claimants is high, especially as the value of these territories is elevated by the strategic location adjacent to sea lanes and reports of valuable deposits in their seabed. However, amidst this strategic uncertainty, there is no desire to see relationships polarized into conflict. Each of the major powers has stated repeatedly the desire for peace, stability, and cooperation. Just yesterday, Secretary Gates and General Ma, among others, have reiterated these aspirations. The region's objectives are thus peace and stability, not the cold peace of the Cold War, but a cooperative relationship where we can work together to tackle security challenges and enhance prosperity. But each of the powers is also aware that there are uncertainties, and the greater the uncertainty, the greater the tendency to want to hedge against them. And this is where transparency plays a crucial role, to avoid misunderstandings and to increase trust and confidence. Military transparency for the Asia-Pacific needs to operate at three levels. At the first level is disclosure of one's armaments and arsenals, providing information about one's military programs, military expenditure, arms exports and imports can reduce the likelihood that such programs would be destabilizing. We can rely on existing mechanisms and enhance them where necessary. In the Asia-Pacific, there has been a degree of such disclosure. The ASEAN Regional Forum, or ARF, has supported the UN Register on Conventional Arms since 1994. The ARF Annual Security Outlook reports seek to enhance the level of information sharing. The more recent voluntary briefings at ASEAN Defence Ministers' meetings complement this process. States that have yet to avail themselves of these opportunities should be encouraged to do so, making such transparency a norm in the region. States also contribute to this first level of transparency by arranging for visits to military facilities and making regular public statements about military procurement, plans, and activities. In today's interconnected world, First-level transparency can be easily augmented through official defense websites with regular updates on military activities and programs through reports, pictures, and videos. However, the first level of transparency is not adequate. We want to go beyond the Cold War, where the situation was one of irreconcilable and opposing ideologies. For the Asia-Pacific, we want to encourage cooperative behavior among states in order to strengthen defense cooperation and enhance security. To achieve this, we need to operate at a higher level of transparency. Transparency is not merely about bean counting what others have in their arsenals, nor is it merely about knowing others' capabilities either. Take a scenario where a state has decided to increase its military spending and the capability of its military because it decides that its defense needs have grown. This could be because the pattern of its trade and energy supply routes has altered fundamentally, or that new areas have been developed, or shifts in population have occurred. Or another scenario where a few states decide to cooperate to increase their ability to improve security, for example, in their sea lanes. Although that state or these states may consider this self-defense or cooperative security, others may perceive it differently and lead to doubts, suspicions, and insecurity. Therefore, transparency must encompass statements of strategic intent, and states need to articulate their security concerns and strategic intent in clear and convincing ways that can reassure others. Countries that understand each other's strategic intent and security concerns are more likely to avoid miscalculations. When we better understand the concerns that we might have about each other, we can more confidently find ways to take these concerns into account and reassure each other. Where we have common concerns, we can find ways to cooperate meaningfully. This second level of transparency can be done through the publication of white papers, government statements or interviews, and dialogues between states. Formal commitments to peace, such as the 2002 Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, are helpful in fostering confidence about states' intentions. Accession to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia is another helpful expression of peaceful and cooperative intent. Such formal commitments and declarations not only provide transparency about a state's intentions, but also provide a useful benchmark against which a state's future actions can be assessed. Commitments to international norms and legal frameworks can further bolster regional trust by providing predictability about states' actions when there are differences in views. I'd like to place particular emphasis on the need for states to commit themselves to the peaceful resolution of disputes based on dialogue and international law, and not on the basis of whose military is stronger. UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, is especially relevant in ensuring peace and stability in the maritime domain. In 1982, UNCLOS was concluded after a long process of negotiation. UNCLOS managed to arrive at a crucial and important balance between the claims of coastal states for more rights over adjacent seas and the rights that user states and other states historically had over the use of the seas. We would be wise to maintain this balance which UNCLOS arrived at, because it benefits both coastal and user states. Indeed, most states are both coastal and user states. As economies in the world become more open and integrated and trade flows increase, countries that used to think in terms of protecting their interests as coastal states will find that they have significant and growing interests as user states as well. And hence, even in individual countries, this balance of interests can shift. Security dialogues also contribute to transparency by providing deeper insights into the thinking behind states' actions beyond declarations. The Shangri dialogue provides a platform for states to to share information and have an open exchange of views so that others understand their actions better. It also serves as a platform for states to voice their concerns, raise questions, and make clarifications. You might ask yourself, why is he responding in this way to what I am saying or doing? Was that what I meant or intended? Is that achieving my purpose? This serves as an invaluable avenue for clarifying one's intentions, adjusting one's actions also, and accommodating differences in perspective. The third level of military transparency refers to the cooperative action that contributes more directly to regional security. This level of cooperative and inclusive action is especially important for the Asia-Pacific region in two ways. First, the region faces multifaceted and transnational security challenges that require international cooperation to resolve. Examples of such challenges include the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, and maritime security. The current cooperation in the Gulf of Aden is a good example of this. Second, the Asia-Pacific is a region that is politically and economically diverse, and where regional security dialogue and cooperation are still works in progress. Concrete action and cooperation in a step-by-step manner among all the regional stakeholders are necessary for stable relations and for the region to work together to tackle common threats. In recent decades, the region has achieved a healthy level of defense cooperation at the bilateral and multilateral levels, establishing a shared commitment to stability and a respect for consensus-based mechanisms and international law. Let me elaborate. The ARF's confidence-building measures boost preventive diplomacy with dialogues and are moving towards concrete mechanisms for cooperation. Most recently, the standby arrangement for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief will facilitate the efficient conduct of such missions in member countries. There is also a web of multilateral and bilateral exchanges and exercises between militaries and government agencies, such as the ARF Maritime Security Shore Exercise and the Western Pacific Naval Symposium's exercises. Cooperative mechanisms, such as the Malacca Strait patrols, have had a positive effect on regional security and enhanced trust between the participating states, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, and Thailand. Looking ahead, Singapore is working to build a multilateral framework for maritime information sharing and cooperation, which is open and inclusive. Interested countries can participate by linking their maritime operations centers, sharing information, and having liaison officers to utilize the Information Fusion Center at the new Changi Command and Control Center, which is being completed this year. Territorial disputes in our region have been settled peacefully through negotiations or by reference to third-party adjudication. For instance, Indonesia and Singapore concluded a maritime boundary agreement in March this year through bilateral negotiations. The sovereignty of Pedra Branca Island was settled peacefully and amicably between Malaysia and Singapore at the International Court of Justice in 2008. This followed a similar resolution in 2002 of Sipadan and Ligitan Islands by Malaysia and Indonesia. Malaysia and Singapore also successfully resolved issues over land reclamation in 2003 at the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea in accordance with UNCLOS. So let me conclude. Military transparency is not an end in itself, but a means to peace and stability. Given the strategic circumstances in our region, and despite its diversity and the potential for tensions, the increasing acceptance and practice of these three levels of transparency have enabled the Asia-Pacific region to gradually foster a norm of dialogue, a culture of defense cooperation, and the acceptance of international legal mechanisms to resolve disputes peacefully. This has built the foundation for a regional security architecture that is inclusive, of regional stakeholders, transparent about capabilities and intentions, and serious about cooperation based on dialogue and the rule of international law. States in the Asia-Pacific have real opportunities to build trust and enhance cooperation for the benefit of all. If we get it right, the region can harness its cooperative energies to mitigate differences that may arise from time to time and achieve our objective of enduring stability and cooperation. We need to do this, not just to overcome security challenges and secure our homelands, but also to work together to build a new prosperity and secure better lives for our people. Thank you very much.
Minister Teo, thank you very much for that presentation, and particularly for reminding us about its thesis that military transparency is not an end in itself. When we come to discussion, we might also wish to explore the question as to whether military transparency in all cases is a good in itself. One wonders whether from time to time in strategy discretion can also sometimes be the better part of valor, and there might even be some kinds of transparency that aren't confidence building. So we might invite discussion on that for the sake of completeness. But before that, Baroness Taylor with a perspective from the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, John. And can I say that I'm delighted to be here representing the UK Ministry of Defence. This is my first time at such a dialogue, and previous UK contributors have told me in no uncertain terms that this is a very important event and a good opportunity to shape the narrative on the vital global security challenges facing us all, and a great opportunity to meet defence and security colleagues from across this region and beyond. And I think that they were certainly right in that advice, and I'd like to add my thanks to the IISS and indeed our hosts for their arrangements this weekend. I want to talk about the global security challenges that face us all today and the importance of defence transparency and cooperation if we are to deal with these issues effectively. My basic premise is that just as we have all come to take as fact that we live in a global economy, so globalisation has the same significance in terms of the security challenges with consequences for our collective responses. It is often said, and it's been said this weekend, that the Asia-Pacific region can be characterised as the engine of a globalising world. But a globalised world also shares the risks. If we just look at the depth and breadth of the international response to the current financial crisis, it affects us all, and though we each take mitigating action, the impact of these actions is so much greater if we can have a coordinated response. It's also apparent in tackling climate change. There is a serious risk that more states will face failure, and the potential for conflict will be exacerbated in those regions of the world that are worst affected. Clearly, we should all strive to counter climate change and to mitigate its effects. But we must recognise that the international community will be under pressure to tackle the humanitarian and the other impacts when crises occur. And those of defence will have to be prepared to assist our governments in these daunting tasks, drawing on all of the skills in defence and the unique capabilities there. The same applies to those intent on terrorism or proliferation. In security and defence, there are no national barriers that will easily deter them. These are truly global threats which require multinational responses. So ensuring a stable, vibrant region is essential for all of us, and I hope that through dialogue and by learning from each other's experience, we will all be stronger and better placed to deal with the multiple challenges that we face. So, what is the UK's perspective on these global security challenges? Our Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, has said recently, "No one could have foreseen the sheer scale of the new global challenges that our growing interdependence brings, their scale, their diversity, and the speed with which they emerged." Last year in the United Kingdom, we published our National Security Strategy, which was the first time we had set out a comprehensive description of these new global challenges and aspects of our response. It was groundbreaking for two reasons. Firstly, it looks at the broad range of threats and challenges and, crucially, brings home their interconnections. Secondly, it brings together the objectives and plans of all the departments, agencies and forces charged with protecting the UK's national security. The strategy also makes a significant contribution to transparency by ensuring that both our domestic audience and other nations understand how we plan to tackle the threats. We're also examining in more detail the interconnections of security challenges such as terrorism, proliferation, transnational organised crime, and fragile failing states. Understanding these relationships is critical in order to tackle the threats that we face. We must all get better at preventing these problems from emerging in the first place, rather than countering them afterwards. It is an evolving process, and we're updating the strategy as I speak. And although we recognise that today security is not just about our armed forces, they clearly have a critical role to play around the world, some conventional, some newer, like capacity building. An example of this, our armed forces play an important role as part of the international conflict prevention effort, helping countries to tackle the serious security challenges arising from instability in their own regions. That is why, for example, the United Kingdom trained some 12,000 African peacekeepers since 2004-2005. We do that to help that region, but it is in our national interest too, because these challenges can have implications for the UK and indeed our citizens around the world. To do all this and to grasp the interconnectivity of today's threats requires a comprehensive approach across government and indeed other sectors. Because although armed forces and ministries of defence have clearly got central roles to play, they cannot deliver whole solutions by themselves. And finally, we need to communicate what we are doing and why more effectively. Perhaps, Mr. Chairman, I can at this point pay tribute to two of our personnel who were sadly killed yesterday in operations in southern Afghanistan. We have had incidents like this very frequently in Britain, and it does cause our public to ask questions about why we are there. And we have to explain to a sometimes sceptical public why counter-terrorism operations in Afghanistan are critical for stopping terrorism on our own streets. We have to explain why countering piracy, stopping people trafficking, or stemming the tide of the drugs trade is essential work for domestic security, and why it matters to individuals and families that our international institutions and international agreements are effective for today's challenges. So much for the UK perspective. What is the Asia-Pacific perspective on these global challenges, and where does the UK fit in? As I, and indeed many others, have said this weekend, there are now very few people who would seriously argue that global security challenges can be contained by state boundaries or that a single state can deal with these alone. This places a much greater reliance on networked solutions at state level, but also at community and corporate level. We need to ensure that all of our international institutions are more effective and geared towards the challenges we actually face, and that they are not merely there to feed bureaucracies. We're already working together effectively in many areas, though I have to agree with Bob Gates's comments yesterday that we must all do more to make sure that collectively